Can you go through life without suffering? Is that possible? I find that many times we go through life making decisions from the perspective of avoiding suffering at all costs. I want you to think of suffering and desire. How do those two things relate with each other? You might find that in the past you made decisions to avoid suffering because you thought that you couldn't achieve a certain goal or you couldn't achieve a certain desire. So the problem is not our desires, but the frustration that we may feel from believing that we cannot achieve our desires. So that thought of not achieving the goal or the dream that you have leads you to think that you shouldn't try to avoid the suffering of not achieving the goal. Avoid the fear of failure or avoid failure itself. And we interpret that as suffering. When you make that kind of decision and you choose to ignore your desires, does that lead to suffering? Yes, it does. And it is the kind of suffering that you cannot hide from. It's the kind of suffering that is shameful and you cannot hide from even when you are in the dark. When we have desires and you choose to ignore them, eventually those desires are like the engine light on your car that if you don't address them, they will completely stop you on your tracks. Stop thinking that you can go through life without suffering. Suffering is part of our existence. Of course, I'm not saying that we have to put ourselves in situations where you completely are torturing yourself under extreme suffering, but we have to shift our perspective of what suffering is and how it relates to our desires and dreams, okay? When you ignore your desires, that will still lead to some kind of suffering. And if you try and you don't achieve the goal and you go through the experience of failing, you will also experience suffering. There's no way to avoid it. So knowing that and looking at it from that perspective, then just choose to go for your goals. Choose to give it a shot, because that kind of suffering that you will experience when you fall short, if you do, when you fail, if you do experience failure, that kind of suffering is the kind of suffering that builds scars, that builds your skills, and that makes you grow, rather than the other type of suffering, which is the suffering where you feel shameful and you have regret for not even trying. See you at the top where the champions belong.